Imagine a teenage girl so convinced she was chosen by God that she faced down kings, generals, and a nation's despair, and they believed her. In the early 1400s, France was bleeding. For nearly a century, the English and the French royal families fought over who should wear the crown. This endless struggle, the 100 Years' War, tore villages apart. Fields were burned. Peasants paid taxes to both sides. Bands of soldiers and raiders turned farmlands into wastelands. In the middle of this chaos, in a quiet corner of northeastern France, lay the tiny village of Domremy. It was here, around 1412, that Joan was born to Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romay. Her family owned a few acres and some livestock, modest by any measure, father's pride. She fed chickens, tended sheep, and patched clothes by firelight. She never learned to read or write, but she listened closely in church, memorizing sermons word for word. Neighbors noticed. Joan prayed more than other children, often alone in the garden or the old village church. But no matter how pious she was, the war did not spare Domremy. English raids and the rival Burgundians sometimes swept through the countryside. Families hid in forests, crops were trampled under knights' horses. People begged heaven for a saviour, but year after year none came. Then when Joan was about 13, she heard a voice in her father's garden. A bright light shone through the branches of an old tree. Later she said it was St. Michael the Archangel, telling her to live well and be brave. Soon the voices returned. St. Catherine and St. Margaret joined him. They didn't just comfort her, they gave her a mission: save France. For 4 years, Joan told almost no one. She feared people would call her a witch or mad. But the voices never left her alone. She once said, "I would rather die than do something against God's will." And when Domremy faced yet another threat, she knew she could stay silent no longer. At 16, Joan made up her mind. She had to reach Charles VII, the rightful heir to the throne. She believed God had chosen her to lead his armies and lift the siege of Orléans, the city the English aimed to crush. She first went to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs. There, she demanded an audience with Robert de Baudricourt, the local garrison commander. He laughed at her. A peasant girl claiming she'd save France sounded absurd. But the townsfolk whispered, "She's honest. She's pure. Maybe she's telling the truth." She refused to leave. When skeptics mocked her, she boldly replied, "I must go where God commands me, even if I wear out my feet to the knees." Her unshakable words stirred respect in hardened soldiers. Finally, a small escort agreed to take her. She cut her hair short like a boy's, dressed in a rough grey tunic and boots, and rode out on horseback in the cold winter of 1429. The journey to Chinon, where Charles hid from the chaos, was dangerous. Joan pressed on, praying at every village church they passed. When she reached Chinon, Charles decided to test her. He stood hidden among courtiers in a candlelit hall while another man posed as the Dauphin. Joan entered the room, glanced at the decoy, then walked straight to the real Charles and knelt before him. Witnesses whispered. How did she know? Charles, desperate and cornered by English victories, allowed church scholars to examine her claims. They asked about her visions, her faith, her intentions. She calmly answered everything. She refused gold, lands, or marriage. She chose a banner over a sword, pure white, embroidered with lilies and the holy names of Jesus and Mary. When asked why she preferred it, she said, "It bore the image of our Saviour. I loved my banner 40 times more than my sword." In the spring of 1429, the French had nearly lost hope. The English had laid siege to Orléans for months. If Orléans fell, nothing would stop them from conquering all of France. Joan arrived in shining silver armour, riding a tall white warhorse, her banner fluttering above her helmet. Hardened soldiers sneered at first. What could a girl do? But they soon watched her rally men who had once fled from battle. In one assault, an arrow struck her shoulder. Soldiers begged her to retreat and rest. She ripped out the arrow herself and climbed back up the siege ladders, waving her banner high where the fighting raged hottest. On May 8, 1429, the siege was lifted. Orléans was free. France had its first real victory in years, led by a teenager who said she only obeyed God. Yet for Joan, this was not enough. She turned to Charles and demanded he be crowned at Reims, the sacred city of kings. Many warned the journey was too dangerous, but people cheered for her wherever she passed. Villages opened gates, nobles pledged loyalty, and her army grew with each mile. On July 17, 1429, inside the Grand Cathedral of Reims, Charles VII was crowned King of France, and by his side stood Joan of Arc, just 17, clad in armour, holding her white banner aloft, the Maid of Orléans, the peasant girl who gave a kingdom hope. But her greatest trials, her deepest betrayal and her final sacrifice were still to come. After the coronation at Reims, Joan of Arc stood at the peak of her fame. She had given France a king, but her visions told her mission was not over. She believed she had to drive the English out completely and reclaim Paris. But now, even with Charles crowned, France was still a kingdom divided. Some of his own nobles feared Joan's growing power. She was a teenage girl from a farm, yet soldiers followed her more faithfully than many high-born commanders. While Charles celebrated, Joan asked for more men and supplies to push onward. She begged him to attack Paris quickly, before the English could regroup. At first, Charles agreed, but his cautious advisors persuaded him to slow down, to negotiate instead of fight. They feared Joan's boldness could drag France into more risk than it could afford. Still, Joan refused to stand by. In the summer of 1429, she led small campaigns around Paris, trying to keep hope alive. But with fewer troops and half-hearted support, these attacks stalled. In September, she attempted to storm Paris itself, but without enough siege weapons and with defenders ready, the attack failed. Joan was wounded by a crossbow bolt in her leg, but insisted on staying until nightfall before retreating. She did not give up. Through winter, she rallied towns still loyal to Charles, encouraged soldiers, and reminded people that France should not lose faith just because nobles bickered. Her letters from this time still survive, signed with a simple cross. They show a young woman exhausted but fiercely determined. In May 1430, the enemy struck back. The town of Compiègne, north of Paris, was under threat from the Burgundians, allies of the English. Joan rode out to defend it with a small force. During a skirmish outside the gates, she stayed behind to cover the retreat of her soldiers. Surrounded by enemy cavalry, she was pulled from her horse and captured alive. She was only 18. Her captors knew her worth. They locked her in a tower, then sold her to the English for a large ransom, 10,000 livres, a fortune for a commoner. The same nobles who once cheered her victories now did nothing to rescue her. The English could not kill her in battle, so they put her on trial instead. They needed to prove she was no saint, but a heretic, a witch, an enemy of the true faith. They dragged her to Rouen, chained her day and night in a cold stone cell. They threatened her with torture and even death by burning if she did not confess her lies. For months in early 1431, churchmen and judges questioned her daily. They demanded she say her voices were demons. They mocked her for dressing in armor and men's clothes, even though she explained she did it for safety among soldiers and in prison. Though uneducated, she spoke bravely and cleverly. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, a trap question, she answered, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." Her words silenced the room. But the verdict was decided long before her first answer. The judges found her guilty of heresy. The punishment, death by fire. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, at 19, Joan was led to the marketplace of Rouen. She wore a simple white shift, her hair roughly shaved. A priest held up a wooden cross for her to see. Witnesses said she forgave her accusers and called out "Jesus" as the flames rose. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine River, as if erasing her would erase the hope she had inspired. But it didn't work. 25 years later, a new trial, ordered by the Pope, cleared her name completely. Witnesses testified she was innocent, loyal, and holy. The Church declared she had died a martyr. Centuries passed. Her story inspired generations, soldiers, poets, even modern freedom fighters. In 1920, the Catholic Church made her St. Joan of Arc. Today, she is the patron saint of France and a symbol that one determined voice can shake kingdoms. From farm girl to warrior to prisoner to saint, Joan of Arc's courage still burns brighter than the flames that try to silence her forever. Follow for more hidden history.